This lesson provides a quick review of group policy. Group policy enables a number of settings to be defined for our client computers and our servers through a centralized means via the Active Directory. A group policy object has a number of settings. So here I have a group policy object open, and I can see there are settings that relate to the computer and also the user. Within the computer, there's a number of different types of policy. I can deploy software. I can control settings related to things like startup and shutdown scripts, which can also be PowerShell. I can define audit policies, who can log on, who has certain rights, control group memberships, and many other types of settings related to the computer. There are also administrative templates, and these are based on ADMX files that really are highly flexible. They're a lot bundled with the operating system, but you can also add your own custom ADMX files to the system that can control other types of configuration. For example, here, this group policy object defines to not display the shutdown event tracker. Normally, when you shut down an operating system that's a server, it will ask you why. So here you can see I've set this to disabled, so it will not prompt me. You could also set this to enabled, and then you can say, well, when should you display this? But I don't want it to display. Note that these group policy settings write to special areas in the registry. So if I later change this to not configured, this policy would actually be removed from all the machines, and they would then be prompted for the shutdown event tracker as per normal functionality. These settings do not tattoo the registry, i.e. that change is permanent. As soon as a policy is removed or a setting set to not configured, it no longer takes effect. Now, there are a huge number of settings available. Luckily, Microsoft provides a group policy settings reference document that you can download, and there are versions available, for example, for 2003, 2008, 2008 R2, and even Vista. And once you download these, it's actually a huge spreadsheet that shows every single ADMX file that's part of the operating system, what all the possible values that you can configure are, where it actually writes that in the registry, and notice they're all part of policies. This is why it does not tattoo the registry. It tells you the requirements, the help text, and this is all displayed in the group policy editor as well. Once I've defined my group policy objects, I then link them within my Active Directory domain, and I can really link them in one of three places. So firstly, I should point out there is a local policy for each machine in Windows. So this isn't stored in Active Directory. These are just local settings you define on a machine. Here I'm just on a member server, and I can go to Windows Settings, and I can see here certain things can be configured. For example, under Security Settings, there are local policies, user rights assignments, for example, and it's showing me who can do what, but this is on the local machine. So this is the first policy that gets defined. Back in my domain, however, I have lots of different group policy objects. Some are supplied as part of a standard Active Directory. For example, there's a default domain policy, and there's also a default domain controllers policy. Now, policies can be linked at a number of different levels. They can be linked at a domain. So I can link a policy to the domain, which will take effect to every user and computer in that domain, and every container and every organizational unit within that domain. I can also link group policy objects to organizational units. So for example, domain controllers has its own OU, and notice there's that default domain controllers policy. So that's created by default because you have more stringent security settings on a domain controller. Who can log on, different security options, etc. So I can define them at domain level, an OU level. I can also link them at a site level. So remember, sites are forest-wide. This is not per domain. It's generally not recommended to link group policy objects at a site level. The reason is, suppose a client in another domain processed that group policy object that's actually stored in a different domain. It now has to do Kerberos authentication to that other domain controller. It's just going to slow down logon. So generally we try and avoid using site-defined group policy objects. But it's highly typical to assign them at the domain and organizational units. In fact, it's one of the key reasons you create organizational units, to apply group policy and delegate administration. Now, the order in which these policies are actually applied is the local policy is applied first. so that local policy to each workstation and server operating system is applied first. Next, policies linked at the domain level are applied. So this means any policy defined in a domain group policy object could override anything set in that local policy. Next, group policy objects linked at an OU level are applied, which means a setting defined in a group policy object linked at the OU unit could override a setting linked at the domain or the local policy level. If you were using any policies defined at the site level, these actually get applied just after local policy. So the actual correct order is local, then site, then domain, then OU. And if you nest OUs inside OUs, the closer the OU is to your object, it gets applied last, so then takes precedence. So local, site, domain, OU is the order of application. But again, typically we don't want to link at the site level, so they wouldn't actually be used. Now, in addition to just linking group policy objects to a domain or an OU, and you can link group policy objects at many different locations, the group policy object lives within the domain, then you can just link it wherever you want. But when you link group policy object, I can select that group policy object, and under scope, it's just telling me where it's linked, if there's any security filtering, which I'm going to talk about in later lessons. But also under details, by default, both the computer and user portions of that group policy object are applied. But if you know there is nothing, for example, in that user portion, then disable those. It's less to process. The smaller the number of group policy objects you have to apply at logon, the better that experience. So try and minimize those if you can. Now, by default, group policy is applied for the computer when it starts up, and also periodically between every 90 and 120 minutes by default. Same for user settings. When the user logs on, it gets any logon scripts, maybe software deployments, and every 90 to 120 minutes. The Group Policy Management Console also shows us a Settings tab. And this is great to quickly see, well, what are the settings actually defined in that group policy object? Remember, all I'm seeing here is the link of group policy objects. Deleting anything here only deletes the link. It does not delete the group policy object. The group policy object is stored down here, and this is where you would actually delete it. This concludes the review of group policy application and group policy objects.